Good afternoon and welcome to the second of our Teach with GIS 15-minute webinars. Today's session is going to be all about water, and in fact there's so much to talk about when it comes to water. This is actually a double feature. So in this first part then, Dave, what are we going to be looking at?
So we're going to start right at the start of that river's journey with a raindrop and look at where does that raindrop end up and how does that form a river. Then we'll move on to lots of raindrops and how does that then create a catchment area. Where do all of those raindrops that fall into the same river start from and end up? Then we'll scale out a little bit and we're going to look at the rivers of the UK, their courses, their catchment areas, and go from there.
Should we get started? So you've probably already noticed that we're starting today's webinar inside the classic map viewer in ArcGIS Online, and that is because we're going to need to use some of these analysis tools. So I click on the Perform Analysis button, and what we're going to do first when we're tracing this raindrop falling into a landscape and how it's going to move downstream to reach the sea, that is a piece of feature analysis. And it's in the Find Locations submenu here. You can see Trace Downstream is right here at the bottom. And if you're interested in what any of these analysis tools do, if you click on the little information button next to them, they will give you more information about what they do. But I know we want to do Trace Downstream, so that's what I'm going to click on first. The first thing that I need to do now I'm in this analysis menu is figure out where my raindrop is falling in this landscape. And I can go anywhere in the world for this.
Anywhere in the world? Wow.
Absolutely anywhere in the world.
It rains quite a lot in the west of the UK, doesn't it? So should we head somewhere in the west?
That sounds good. And I think it's always interesting to do this exercise somewhere where there's some proper topography, somewhere where there's a bit of up and down. So should we head
to the Lake District?
Head to the Lake District. Anywhere in particular you want me to place this raindrop? Over here somewhere? Okay. So you saw me pick up the point. I'm just going to click to add a point. I don't need to worry about the settings on part 2 for this particular example. I am going to give this a new layer name to make it easier for me to find later. And I'm also going to untick Use Current Map Extent. I'm doing that because if this raindrop is going to take a convoluted course to get to the sea, if it's going to come sort of over to the east or anything interesting like that, unticking Current Map Extent will let the GIS perform an analysis outside of this map window. So it will continue to trace it even if the path goes off screen. And now I'm ready. I'm going to hit Run Analysis.
So it can take a little while for that analysis to run out. So it's quite handy to know in advance that that's the case. If you're planning on doing this in real time in front of a class, it's probably a good idea to have a kind of Blue Peter example that you've made earlier, so you don't have to sit and watch this cycle through. And there it is. The GIS has drawn us a line on the map, the journey that raindrop is going to take downstream.
We're just going to look in a little bit more detail at this river that we've predicted now by zooming in. And we can see from the base map that we've got here that the predicted course of the river is not exactly the same as the actual course.
So you might notice down here in the middle course where the river's starting to meander around a little bit, that actually our trace has missed out some of those meanders. It's kind of taken a bit of a shortcut. And that's because what the GIS is doing is working out from the topography where it thinks the river should be. And down the bottom, or down in the middle course here, where the bottom of the valley is quite flat and wide, we know that the river could be anywhere across that flat, wide valley bottom. So it's made its best guess. And the best guess in some situations or some occasions isn't always spot on. If we look a little bit further upstream, where the river is a bit more constrained within a valley, then those guesses that the GIS is making are a lot more accurate. So we've traced the journey of a single raindrop downstream. But what about lots of raindrops all joining together? Can we trace the catchment area of this river and see what other bits of land sit within that catchment? Well, we can. In the same place in our analysis tools, we've also got this tool to create watersheds. So first of all, I need to choose the downstream point that I'm draining towards, or that my watershed is draining towards. So I'm going to click at the pin and pop it down near to where my river trace line joins the sea. So just down here in this estuary.
If you're interested in calculating a catchment, you don't have to have the river drawn in advance, do you?
It's useful if you're not sure where the river flows from and to. So if you are doing what we're doing and kind of tracing that journey downstream and you're not sure where that raindrop is going to meet the sea, it might be a handy thing to have done in advance. So we can ignore point 2, just like before, and I need to give my layer a name. And again, just like before, a name that I've not used somewhere else. And then I also need to make sure that use current map extent is unticked, because we're pretty confident that the catchment area of this river is going to extend beyond the screen that I've got visible at the moment. And we don't want to truncate it to the edge of my display.
And again, this is quite a chunky bit of analysis, so it's worth stressing if this is an activity that you're going to get your students to do in class, for example, you'll probably want something else for them to be doing while this analysis is running in the background.
And there it is, our catchment area, or the drainage basin that's draining into this point in the Solway Firth.
That is so much bigger than I imagined it was going to be.
Yeah, and it extends a lot further up into the Cheviots than maybe I would have guessed as well.
Yeah, I almost sort of expect those to kind of drain into the Tyne there, or sort of some of the other rivers that are kind of draining to the other coastline, essentially. That's actually where I think sometimes it can be helpful to move from a 2D vision of this catchment into a 3D one, because it's not always clear from the 2D map when you first look at it quite where the slopes are. So where sort of a raindrop can fall on either side of a hill and essentially have a radically different journey to reach the sea, even though it starts from even just a few centimeters away from another raindrop.
So shall we open this catchment area up in Scene and take a look at that?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's kind of illustrate this in 3D to explore what I mean a little bit more. So the easiest way to get from map into scene is to click on the home button in the top left and just select scene from the drop-down menu. That will load up the 3D map viewer, ArcGIS Online Scene. I'm just going to get rid of this splash screen here. And the first thing that I need to do is go and find those layers that we just created in the 2D map. So to do that, I'm going to hit the Add Layers button. I'm going to browse layers. So I'm searching in my content because this is something that I've actually created for myself. It's not a layer that I've borrowed from somebody else. So there's the layer that we just created. I'm going to hit the plus and add this to my scene. And it will automatically zoom me into that catchment. I'm just going to click done as well, because I always like to tidy those menus away once I've finished working in them. And we can see there on the scene viewer, there's that catchment that we just saw in 2D. Here it is in 3D. I'm just going to zoom to the edge of the catchment there and turn this from a plan view into a sort of 3D in the landscape view instead. And there we go. We can see really straightforwardly, raindrops that fall meters apart from one another are going to take radically different journeys.
You can really see how the edge of that watershed is kind of tracing the top of those hills or along those ridge lines, can't you?
Now, in part 2 of the webinar, we're going to talk a lot more about how we can further explore river catchments and river courses in the scene viewer, but we're going to save that for part 2. Right now, we're going to go and look at something related.
So far, we've been using the GIS to create all of our river courses and catchments from scratch. We don't have to do that for every river that we want to study. Um, we've got some tools that you can just take and use off the shelf that will help with that as well. So we're going to take a look at this UK Rivers Atlas.
And
Can we
Dave, this,
find...
sorry,
Oh,
I was going to
no,
big
go
you
on.
up.
I was going to not let you big me up.
Oh, no, I think I quite like to big you up if that's okay.
Okay, big away.
So Dave, this is one of the resources that you've created, and I'm always blown away by just how pretty the cartography is on this to start with. I really love the way that you visualized it all. Can you talk us through a little bit more about what we're looking at here?
Yes. So what we've got are the major rivers of the UK. The smaller coastal rivers are symbolised in the kind of same light blue shade, but all of the dominant rivers, the major rivers, are distinguished from each other in these lovely colourful channels. If we're looking for a river in a particular area, we can zoom in and click on that area to find a little bit more about the river that that's near us. So for us, this was our catchment that we've just drawn.
Oh wow, so there we go. We see it's pretty similar. The sort of route that the raindrop took to find the sea is matching quite well with the actual course of the River Eden, which we'd expect, but it's always nice to see that that is what's happening in reality as well.
So as well as having the river's course and the catchment outline, there's also a little bit more information about that river itself. So the main channel length from source to mouth, the area of that catchment area, and an average discharge towards the mouth of that river.
That's really cool in terms of being able to compare and contrast some of the different major river systems in the UK in terms of, their outputs, where they're collecting their inputs from. I really like this.
Yeah, and I think there's something really interesting about comparing what might look like a large river catchment, but if it's in a fairly dry area like the southeast, it can have a lower discharge than a relatively small looking catchment somewhere really rainy like Scotland.
That's a really nice exercise for students to go and see and start to understand some of the dynamics of these river systems throughout the UK.
If we know the name of the river that we're studying, we don't have to just click around until we find it. We can use this little selector tool at the top right.
So I just want to pick up a little bit on the accuracy of these river lines as we're zooming in and out on the trend here as well. I noticed that as we're doing that, it's redrawing itself a little bit. Why is it sort of redrawing the course of that river?
Yeah, so within this map, we've actually got two different resolutions of river sort of data sets. So the Corsa resolution is derived from a digital elevation model, kind of exactly the same process that's happened when we asked the GIS to predict where our raindrop was going to travel down that river's course. So those are created by a computer. And as we zoom in, we move into the river lines that have been surveyed and mapped by the Ordnance Survey. So while some of these might have been detected by a computer, they've been checked by a human who's actually been to that location on the ground and said, yes, there is a river here and this is the route it takes. If that river disappears underground or it flows through a lake, those kind of connections might not be made. You might end up with little gaps or holes in your river channels.
Okay, so that's helpful for explaining to students if they spot these anomalies and sort of why they occur. They're sort of byproducts of the mapping process, essentially. And it's always useful, I think, to touch on that idea of the map as being a representation of reality, but never a kind of objective truth.
Yeah, definitely. I think these are, I guess they're the best maps of rivers that we've got at those scales, but they're not absolutely perfect.
One last little thing to touch on. I'm just going to put the Thames back on because I noticed when we were sort of comparing and contrasting at the start of this example, it always surprises me how close some of these major river basins are to each other. I tend to think of the Thames, I associate it, with London, with the southeast, But here we are, just a little way sort of southeast of Birmingham, and here's the edge of the Thames catchment because it is so massive and it runs pretty close to the Trent.
Yeah, as someone who grew up in the Midlands, I definitely think of the River Thames as a southern river, but it's startlingly close to where I grew up.
Yeah, it's really interesting to use river catchments as a kind of alternative organising geography as well, because it turns out that we actually grew up in the same river catchment.
So loads of really cool things that we can do with rivers there. That's the end of our first 15 minutes, but luckily we scheduled a second 15 minutes for this one. So we will see you over in the second part of this webinar.
See you there.